Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Today we're getting still further into the fascinating world of scales. We'll be listening to more of our 14 must-know scales and examining their fingerings. The subject of scales is the densest information in music, and we won't even be done with it today. Every scale has many fingerings. This is lesson 16, so open your book to page 16 and grab your musical slide rule too. You'll also need those color-coded scale fingering charts today as well. All set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. This is our third hour on the subject of scales, and we're not even, as I mentioned in the opening, we're not even going to be done with it today. We got a lot of stuff to cover. This is the meatiest subject in music. This is the one that you're really going to have to do some homework, and you may have to look at these tapes over a couple, 3 times to really get it, because there's an awful lot of information here. I know that. I know you don't 100% see where this is all going yet either, but you will over the next couple of hours, so it's another one of those places where you just got to trust me. You know the grunt work you have to be working on. You got to be practicing your chromatic scales. You got to be practicing your chords. Now we're going to be introducing you to a whole bunch of new scale fingerings as well, too, that you're going to want to be looking at and adding to your practice regimen every day. You are laying the groundwork so that you will become a good, competent, professional level guitar player over the next, say, 5 years. You don't see where all of this is going quite yet, but just be patient. You will. By the time you're done with this whole program, you're going to know everything about music, and the reason that you're learning all of this rather complex stuff is going to become quite clear as we go through the rest of this. Now, this is the subject of scales. It's level 4 of our 6 levels of pitch theory. Pitch patterns in order of complexity. And remember, we started off with silence, and then we looked at the concept of one note, where we learned that every pitch pattern in music has a root note. Then we went to the hugely important subject of intervals, where we looked at the pitch relationships between any 2 notes. Now the notion is, in level number 4 here, scales, is what we're doing is we're taking a bunch of intervals and we are combining them together to make these more complex patterns. A scale is, yes, it's a sequence of notes, but almost what's more significant to note is the space that's in between the notes. Remember, 2 of the main intervals that we're looking at for right now are whole steps and half steps. Remember, a half step is when you're looking at 2 notes that are right next to each other. They're going to be consecutive frets on the fretboard of your guitar. They're going to be consecutive notes on your keyboard, no matter what color they are. Whole steps are when you play a note and then you skip a note to go to the next note after that. See, there's a note in between there that you're skipping. Here, there is no note in between. And half steps and whole steps are examples of intervals, and so scales, remember when we defined a scale, we said it was a sequence of notes. Everybody knows that. But almost more importantly, it's to understand that they are separated by very specific intervals, essentially seconds. Remember, a minor second is another name for a half step, a major second is another name for a whole step, and an augmented second is another name for a step and a half. Remember, there's a few scales on our list. For example, harmonic minor down here, where actually you skip over 2 notes to get from one note to the next. So that's a 1.5-step interval in that scale right there. Now, 2 other things that I wanted to make sure I reminded you of this week are, when we looked at these finger charts last week, and one that we've looked at so far is the major scale finger chart here. And we said that, you know, when you examine the fretboard of the guitar, it really requires 6 frets to actually control the instrument. The 4 frets that your fingers are actually occupying, and then remember 1 fret on either end of that where you either do your index finger shifts to get the notes on the upper gray fret, or you shift your pinky out to get the notes on the lower gray fret down there. So it really requires 6 frets to control the neck of the guitar. If you think back to the show that we did on chromatic scales, I'm going to grab my guitar here for a moment, you know that if you understand the concept of the chromatic scale, which hopefully you do, and you guys have all been practicing your chromatic scales, you know that anywhere that you are on the neck of the guitar, you can play every single one of those 12 notes for a distance of about 2 1/3 octaves, like this. You know, I'm doing index shifts when I go up the scale, and then when I come down the scale, I'm using pinky shifts. Now, what that should tell you is if you're playing every single one of the 12 notes within a particular area of the guitar, and remember that you can do that anywhere on the neck of the guitar, if you think about it, what that must mean is that you can play every single one of these scales in every single one of the 12 keys anywhere on the neck of the guitar. That's what we're trying to get you to set you up to understand. Some of you may have taken lessons where you're taught the position way, like first position, second position on the neck of the guitar. You'll see how all that integrates into my program here too, but I'm actually trying to give you what I think is a more flexible and broad view of the fretboard of the guitar. That is, if you understand the concept of the chromatic scale, that you can play all 12 notes anywhere on the neck of the guitar, that must mean that you can play any scale in any key anywhere on the neck of the guitar. A lot of people think they have to play an A scale down here and a D scale up here, for example. But no, you can play an A and a D and a C and an F and a B flat and any one of the 12 keys right here, or right here, or right here, or right here, anywhere. If you get to that level with the instrument, that's total mastery of the fretboard. That is very handy, particularly if you want to be a jazz player, if you want to be a hot improviser on the guitar. You've got to know all these multiple scale fingerings. Now, that's what we were attempting to show you when we looked at this fingering chart here last week. And remember, the first one that we've looked at so far is simply the chart for the major scale, the Ionian mode. Let me suggest that within this box here, this 6-fret box, any one of the notes could be the root note, couldn't it? Any one of the notes could be do, note number 1 for that do-re-mi scale. And what we see as we go through each of these boxes is that red dot. Remember, our color coding system too. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The colors of the spectrum, the colors of the rainbow. Spells the name Roy G. Biv. R-O-Y-G-B-I-V. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Those are the 7 degrees of the scale. Since red is note number 1, if you want to know where the root note is in any one of these chord charts here, it's just, you have to look for the red dot. And notice how in each one of these boxes, the red dot moves up by 1 fret. Here it's on the absolute lowest note you can play. Here, it's gone up 1 fret to here. In this box, it's gone up to be under your 2nd finger. Here, it's gone up to be under your 3rd finger on your low E string. Here, it's under your pinky. Here, it's a finger shift. Here, it's on your next string on your 1st fret. Here, it's up to your 2nd finger. Here, it's up to your 3rd finger. Here, it's up to your pinky again. Here, it moves to the next string. Here, it moves to the next fret up. And the only reason it doesn't go any further than this is if it did, it would bring you right back to this one again. Notice there's 12 different fingerings for a major scale. And that means that the red dot is on every single one of the frets in this entire box at some point or another. What that means is you could play with your hand in one position on the neck of the guitar. You could play a major scale in any one of the 12 keys without even moving your hand. Pretty cool, huh? Now, the thing to realize is you've got all of these other scales on this chart that you'd want to learn too. For example, here's Dorian. Dorian is a minor scale. On here, it's down on this area of the chart here. You have 12 different fingerings for the Dorian scale as well. And each time the red dot moves up one. Now, if you're looking at your Dorian finger chart, you might recall that Dorian is a minor scale, which means it has a flat 3, and it also has a flat 7 in it. So when you look at this chart here, you'll remember that yellow is 3, and you'll also see a little flat sign on there, indicating that that's actually a flat 3. You might remember that violet is 7. That's the 7th note. And since Dorian has a flat 7, you'll always see a little flat symbol on the violet dot there, indicating that those are the flatted 3rds and the flatted 7s. You need to master all of these different fingerings so that you can play a Dorian scale in all 12 keys anywhere on the neck of the guitar. I know this is a long row to hoe. It's not like you have to master all this stuff this week or this month. I always say, remember, as I mentioned last week, start with the easiest ones. For example, number 10 up here, you'll notice it has no finger shifts in it at all. It can be played all within a 4-fret range. So this might be one of the easy first ways to play Dorian. And when you do, a good idea is to start on a root note. Start on a red note and play 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 8, and you can actually get a sense that way of what that scale actually sounds like if you start on the root notes too. You have one of these scale charts for every single one of these scales on your must-know list here. I'm not going to show you too much more about those today, because what I really want to get involved with today is listening to what these scales sound like and start to see, as I mentioned before, that these are scales that you use every day, and a lot of people are confused about that, but that's actually the stuff we're going to look at mostly today. The finger charts, if you just review these first 3 shows on scales, it'll eventually sink into your mind about exactly how you're supposed to use these finger charts, and we'll get back and talk about them a little bit more later. But what I really want to do is today is I want to familiarize you with these different scales by how they sound. Now, I'm going to play some of these on the guitar. I certainly know you're here to take guitar lessons, but as we've seen so many times before, in many ways it's almost easier to examine them on the keyboard, because everything is so nice and linear. Also today, I'm going to play a couple of little ditties, little songs for you to show you how these scales actually work in given songs with different chord progressions, and it's easier for me to do that on the keyboard as well, because since you can do 2 distinctly different things on the keyboard, I can play chords with one hand and play the melody notes with the things in my right hand. It'll be a little easier for me. But there you are, you've got your guitar, you've got your finger charts. When I'm talking about a particular scale, make sure you've got your finger chart for that scale in front of you. Make sure you're looking at your fretboard and trying to think through this stuff on the guitar as well. Now, another thing I want to remind you about that I think I almost forgot to do completely last week is your good old friend, the musical slide rule. This is one of the most valuable educational musical tools you'll ever find. Someday you'll be able to do without it when you've got all this information memorized, but for now, this is just a fabulous way of looking at the spellings of all of these different pitch patterns in any one of the 12 keys you want. Remember, this side of the slide rule right here, although it doesn't specifically say that word anyway, where it says major diatonic modes, harmonic minor modes, this side of the musical slide rule is completely devoted to scales. And if you look at it carefully, you will see on this page, on this side of the slide rule, are listed essentially every single one of the scale patterns that you see on this chart right here, including your very first one up here in the upper left-hand corner is our good old friend, the major diatonic scale. 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3, half step to 4, whole step to 5, whole step to 6, whole step to 7, half step to 8. You'll notice right under that is the Dorian mode. They are not in the same order on your slide rule here as they are on our big chart here, but when we talk about modes next time, I'll explain to you why that is. But you will notice that every scale on your must-know list of scales is somewhere on your musical slide rule here too. So, and again, by sliding the alphabet thing through the middle here, you can examine the spellings of every single one of these scales in all 12 of your keys. As so many times, just to make it easier on me, on us music teachers, basically, as we listen to these scales today and examine them, we're going to mostly be doing them in the key of C, or relative to C being our root note. So one thing you could do is you could grab your slide rule and you could set it up so that in your upper left-hand corner, in note number 1 of your major scale up there, you have the alphabet letter C. That way, your slide rule will be set up to be in the key of C. We are going to examine each one of these scales today and listen to what they sound like. They all, a scale is a pitch pattern, and like any pitch pattern, eventually you have to learn all these scales 4 different ways. You have to know them as a theory. That is, you have to memorize their patterns of intervals. You eventually have to know what these scales look like when you see them written on paper in notational form. Most importantly, though, like any pitch pattern, you've got to do some ear training and learn what all of these different patterns sound like. Finally, 4th, you have to learn the finger patterns to actually play them on your instrument, and that's what those finger charts are all about. But what we're going to do now is we're going to listen to these scales and notice the similarities and the differences between them. First thing to remind ourselves is on our chart here, we have certain distinct different groupings of scales. We have major scales above this red line here. We have 3 of them. Ionian, or the major diatonic scale, Lydian mode, and Mixolydian are all major scales. I'll tell you how you know they're major scales in a moment. Between these 2 red lines here, these 5 scales are all sad-sounding minor scales. Melodic minor, Dorian, Phrygian, Aeolian, harmonic minor. Below that, we have a couple of pentatonic scales listed. Pentatonic means 5 notes. These scales have fewer notes per octave, so also notice they have some larger intervals in them. If you have fewer notes to cover the octave, that must mean that they're spaced further apart. Finally, we have 2 symmetrical scales down here. By symmetrical, I mean that they have a very profound symmetry to their pattern of intervals. A whole tone scale is all whole steps. A diminished scale goes whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Of course, our 3rd absolutely symmetrical scale is our good old original friend up here, the chromatic scale, which of course is a sequence of 12 half steps. Now, last week we spent a lot of time examining the major diatonic scale. It is, after all, the central pitch pattern in Western music. At least it has been historically. There is a lot of modern music that doesn't pay as much homage to the major diatonic scale as music from the past. But nonetheless, if you're going to examine the basic structures in music, certainly one of the first patterns you have to really get your mind around is the major diatonic scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. This is also the scale that the musical number system works off of. Why? Because it is the central scale in Western music. It is a major scale. Remember this, Ionian mode, major diatonic scale, we know is a major scale because of that note right there. Remember, the difference between major and minor when it comes to complex patterns like scales and chords is what is happening with the 3rd degree of the scale. Major type scales include note number 3. That is the note that's 2 whole steps above the root. Notice how each one of these 3 scales, major diatonic, Lydian, and Mixolydian, notice how they all contain note number 3, which is 2 whole steps above the root. They differ in other ways, like this has got a 4, these 2 have a 4, but this one has a sharp 4. Another thing that all major scales have to have is they have to have a 5 in them. So if a scale has a 3 and a 5 in it, you know it's a major scale. Minor scales have the flatted 3rd in it. That's how they differ. Isn't that interesting that the only difference between major patterns and minor patterns, they all have 5s. But the most interesting thing about them, the thing that really distinguishes them, is whether they have the 3rd or whether they have the flatted 3rd in them. Notice this scale up here, our 2nd major scale that we're going to look at, is the Lydian mode. It's a major scale because we know it has a 3 and a 5 in it, but it's not the major diatonic scale because it doesn't have a 4. It has a sharp 4 in it. And if we listen to that scale, let's listen to what that sounds like on our keyboard here. Here's our good old friend, the major scale again. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Actually, I think I'll play down an octave down here. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Key of C. Half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. Now, our Lydian mode down here, remember, is the scale that has the sharp 4. Let's listen to that. 1, 2, 3, sharp 4. Here's do, re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, fi, sharp 4, 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Remember that Led Zeppelin song I played last time? Had that sharp 4 kind of relationship in it. Not only that, Lydian mode is a very common scale. You're listening to that going, wow, that sounds weird. I've never heard that scale before. I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes that it's in just about every song you've ever heard in a funny kind of way. Now, our third major scale, another hugely important scale in music, is the Mixolydian mode. It's also a major scale. It's got a 3 and a 5, but notice how when you get up to the 7th note, you don't have note number 7. You have the note that's a half step lower than that, the flat 7. Now, if we listen to that one, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oops, that's the 7. Here's the flat 7. 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Flat 7, 8. Now, that scale doesn't sound as exotic, does it? You might say to yourself, oh, boy, I have heard that scale a lot. The only reason you might not have noticed it before is it's so friendly sounding that a lot of people have never noticed the difference between that and the do-re-mi scale itself, the major diatonic scale. Mixolydian is probably the second most common scale in popular music. I know this is different than you've been told by other people. You've been told things like pentatonic scales are much more common, particularly in rock music. That's largely not accurate, interestingly enough. When you really get the big picture in music, you'll see. Those are our 3 major scales, and they're meant to go, by the way, along with major chords. When do you use major scales and when do you use minor scales? Well, it all depends on what chord you're playing these scales over in the song. Generally, as a general rule, major scales go with major chords in certain situations and minor scales go with minor chords in certain situations. What are those situations like? Are they weird situations that you only encounter once in a while? No. I'm going to show you how it is that I could suggest that you use Ionian, or the major diatonic scale, Lydian and Mixolydian in practically every song you'll ever play. And people go, well, even that violates what I've been told before. I thought a particular song was based on a particular scale, that there was one scale that works with each song, and the song is kind of based on that scale. Well, the answer is you can sort of look at music that way, but you might not really get the big picture that way. A better way, I feel, to look at the relationship between scales and songs is that, in a sense, there is a separate scale for each chord that's in the song. So, if the average pop piece of popular music has 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different chords in it, then you might see that you're actually going to wind up using 4 or 5 or 6 of these different scales in any tune you play. And I'm going to play right now, I'm going to show you how in the very popular, everybody knows this song, the Christmas Carol, Silent Night, I'm going to show you that right within Silent Night, which is a little tune that everybody thinks is just based on the major diatonic scale, the do-re-mi scale, I'm going to show you that right within the melody of that song are all 3 of these scales. Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian are 3 different scales that you use right within a simple tune like that. I could just as easily use Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Mary Had a Little Lamb, or I could use like any pop tune you heard on the radio today. All of these scales are present in all of these songs, but in such a simple little ditty, you'll see what I'm talking about. Here is Silent Night. I'm going to play it on the piano. It's going to be a little tough here. Forgive me if I play a wrong note or two here. But here, of course, you know Silent Night. Now, everybody thinks that piece just works off of this scale. Do you hear that scale kind of is the backbone of that song? Like it sounds... Oops. It sounds like that particular scale has everything to do with that song. That song has 3 different chords in it. For those of you who know something about music, that's Silent Night, like so many other songs, is what's called a 1-4-5 progression. In fact, on your slide rule, set up in the key of C, down here below the word major diatonic modes, we don't really have to look at this, but you'll see down here it says common progression 1-4-5. Notice that the 3 chords that are in Silent Night, as in so many other 1-4-5 progressions, are C, F, and G. C major chord, F major chord, G major chord. Those were the 3 different chords that I was just playing on the piano just then. And along with that, I was playing that all familiar melody to Silent Night. And it certainly seemed as though that scale was the backbone of that piece, and it almost seemed as though that was like the only scale that was at work. And a lot of people are going to try to tell you that that's what's going on. But I want to show you right within the melody of that song that there is a separate scale for each chord, and I'm going to actually show you in the melody where that sharp 4 is. You think that's a weird sounding note that you've never heard, but that sharp 4 is right in the melody of Silent Night. I'm going to show you right where that flat 7 is in Mixolydian mode, right within this, because with those 3 different chords that are in the song, these are the 3 different scales that we're using. Ionian is over the C chord, so we're playing a C major scale. Notice on your slide rule that if you look at Lydian, you're going to the Lydian mode, which is about a fair way down the page here. Notice on your slide rule, if you put C in the window for Ionian there, that if you look down here at where Lydian is, number 4, that F shows up in there. And notice that when you get to Mixolydian, which is number 5, G shows up there. Remember, those are exactly the same notes that were in your 1-4-5 progression. So actually, in this piece, it actually turns out the 3 scales I'm playing are C Ionian, F Lydian, and G Mixolydian. You're also going to discover when we talk about modes next time that all 3 of those scales have exactly the same notes in them. That's the weird world of modes. That'll totally blow your mind when we get to that. But now listen to this. We're going to break down the melody as related to the chord progression in Silent Night. First of all, we start on our tonic chord, which is a C major chord. And we can certainly see that my melody notes are notes within that C major scale. Now I go to my 5 chord, which is G, and then I go back to my 1 chord again. Now this is where it gets interesting. Listen to this next chord. I'm going to play an F chord here, which is the 4 chord, and listen to this melody right here. Oops. Round yon virgin. Hear that note right there? Listen to this. There's that sharp 4. Round yon virgin. At this moment in the song, we are actually playing F Lydian. Listen to this scale. 1, 2, 3, sharp 4. Now I go back to my 1 chord again. Now I go back here again. There's that sharp 4 again. Back to the 1 chord again. Now listen to what happens when I go to this G chord, which is my 5 chord. Sleeping heavenly. Listen to this note right here. Sleeping heavenly. You hear that note right there? That's your flat 7. In this part of the song, we're actually playing Mixolydian, and that note right there is the flat 7 in this scale, which is the scale that goes with this chord. See, there's your flat 7. To play a major scale, the Ionian mode, we'd have to hit that note. That note would sound pretty weird in this song right now, wouldn't it? It sounds less weird to hear that flat 7. Sleep in heaven. Flat 7, 8. Oops. And then it's just... So hopefully I managed to demonstrate to you right there that right within a simple ditty, which everyone is always trying to tell you is based on the major scale, which in a way it is, you'll see that when we talk about modes, that right within that scale, the melody actually contains elements of of these different scales that we've never heard of before. Imagine if a simple little ditty like that has all these different scales in it. Imagine the more complex music you're listening to and how many different scales that it must have in it. So hopefully I managed to convince you that really you do use these scales every day, and a lot of times they just don't tell you that because they're afraid you're not going to understand it. But hopefully I think I'm presenting this in a way that you'll see that it works. Let's listen to some of these minor scales now. These are sad-sounding scales: melodic minor, Dorian, Phrygian, Aeolian, and harmonic minor. Some of you who've taken some music theory courses have been told that there's only 3 minor scales: melodic minor, natural minor, and harmonic minor. Boy, I don't know why they teach it that way. Historically, there is some relevance to classical music, thinking just purely about the scales that way. But we're looking at modern music, and we're looking at all the different patterns of intervals that be considered to be minor scales. And actually, there's more than 5 of them. In the next few weeks, we're going to look at several other ones besides these. We actually have a minor pentatonic scale further down the list here. So we actually have 6 minor scales on here, and I can think of a few other ones besides that too. But these, again, is your must-know list of scales. And let's listen to some of these. These are sad-sounding scales. They have this flatted third in them, and that's the note that makes things sound sad. When do you use minor scales? Well, most of the time you use minor scales to play over minor chords. Minor chords are sad-sounding chords. They also have the flatted third. If this is note number 1, a major chord goes 1, 3, 5. Hopefully I've mentioned that enough times so that'll stick in your mind. A major chord goes 1, 3, 5. Notice how your major scales all have a major chord embedded inside them. Every major scale has a major chord inside it, 1, 3, 5. Every minor scale has a minor chord inside it, 1, flat 3, 5. If you take 1, 3, 5 and you take your third and drop it down by a half step to your flatted third, that's what makes the chord sound sad. That's a C minor chord. This is a C major chord. What type of scales do you play over a minor chord? You play a minor scale. And just like we saw in different chord progressions, different times when you would use these different major scales, there are different situations in which you use these different minor scales. Let's listen to them first and get a sense of what they sound like. Our first minor scale we're going to look at is what's called melodic minor. Now, there's an old-fashioned way of looking at melodic minor, and there's a more modern way of looking at melodic minor. The old-fashioned way suggested that melodic minor had different intervals and different notes, whether you were going up the scale or whether you were coming back down. When you go up the scale, it's pretty much like a major diatonic scale, except it's got a flatted third. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But when you come back down the scale, you're supposed to play the flat 7 instead of the 7 and the flat 6 instead of the 6. That would sound like this. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, flat 7, flat 6, 5, 4, flat 3, 2, 1. Back in the 19th and 18th century, it was suggested that melodies in more classical types of music sounded better if over a minor chord you used a scale that had different patterns of intervals going up and down. So it sounded like this. I'll play that scale again without my horrible singing over it. Flat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, flat 7, flat 6, 5, 4, flat 3, 2, 1. Remember, you have a finger chart in there for melodic minor, and you could be playing right along with me. Remember, I'm in the key of C. If you make that red dot, any one of the red dots on your melodic minor page, be a C note on your fretboard of your guitar, you've got your fretboard chart here too, then you could play along with me at this point. It might be a stretch for some of you to do that too, but let me just remind you of that. That's melodic minor. That's now in the modern age, we don't tend to worry so much about that flat 6 and that flat 7 as being part of melodic minor. There's plenty of music that goes up using the 6 and the 7 and down using the 6 and 7. I'm sure you've heard music that sounds like this. Notice how I played the 6 and the 7 both going up the scale and down, instead of flat 6, flat 7 coming down. So we tend to just think of melodic minor these days as a minor scale that simply is identical to the major diatonic scale, except that it has a flatted third. Now, our next minor scale on our list here is the Dorian mode. Next week, we're going to be talking about the fascinating, mind-boggling world of modes. Some of you have heard of modes before, and I bet you're terrified because no one's ever been able to get you to understand how modes work. I seem to be the only one on the planet who can do that. Totally blow your mind when we get there. Dorian mode is a minor scale. How do we know? It's got a flat 3 and it's got a 5 in it. But it also, notice, has a flat 7 in it. That's how it's different than, say, melodic minor. It has a flat 3 and a flat 7. Sounds like this. 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6. Half step to flat 7, 8. That's what that scale sounds like. That's what Dorian sounds like. You have a page, a finger chart which has all Dorian fingerings too. So you could try playing C minor. Remember, you can always stop this tape and rewind it and go over another section. As I said before, you'll probably want to look at some of these really complex shows. You'll probably want to look at them several times. Make sure you got your finger charts out and you're experimenting with this on your guitar. It's just easier for me to show you this stuff on the keyboard right now. Our next minor scale on the list is the Phrygian mode. Weird name, weird scale. First of all, it's the first scale on our list here that the first interval in the scale is actually a half step. It's not a whole step the way every single other one has been so far. It's a half step. We go from 1 to flat 2. But then we have a whole step to flat 3, and we also have a 5, so even though it starts off a little weird, it's still basically a minor scale. 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5. Notice how we also have another altered note, though. We have a flat 6, as well as a flat 7 and an 8. This scale, there's relatively little left of the major scale anymore. A lot of, altered notes. Let's listen to this one. Listen to this weird first interval here. 1, flat 2, flat 3. 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. 1. Oops. Grab your Phrygian finger chart page. Find one of the Phrygian fingerings that doesn't have any finger shifts in it. Start on the red dot and play that finger pattern, and you will be playing that scale right there. And notice, it sounds a little bit odd, but at the same time, you might also notice, wow, that sounds a little bit familiar, too. I have heard these things before. This is not totally weird alien stuff. You've heard that scale a million times. You just didn't know that you were. Our next minor scale on the list is the central, most important, and most common minor scale in music. As such, it has, as you might notice, it has several different names. One of its main names, and where you would have first heard of it if you took another music theory class, is this is the scale that is called the natural minor scale. Natural minor. Also, though, it is a part of our system of modes. It also has a modal name. It's called the Aeolian mode. Sometimes it is referred to as a minor diatonic scale, as opposed to the major diatonic scale. It's the minor diatonic scale, and it is also tied up in the concept of what's known as relative minor, which we are going to look at later on. So, different things you want to associate with this scale is it's called the natural minor, it's called the Aeolian mode, it's called minor diatonic, and it's also associated with the concept of relative minor. If we could look up here, too, another interesting thing to see is these two scales, major diatonic and minor diatonic. These form a very important relationship to one another, which is known as the relative major, relative minor relationship. There's kind of a yin-yang thing going on here. I often draw the little yin and yang symbols here. You know that, the Buddhist symbols for the two different opposing forces. This is kind of, the major diatonic is kind of the light side of the force in music. Its darker, sadder, negative cousin is the minor diatonic, Aeolian mode. So we draw the yang symbol down here. These have a very important relationship. In fact, over on this side of the chart, over here, I'm going to draw a line between these two. And later on, when we get into modes and stuff, we're going to investigate more about what that very important relationship is between those two different sides of the force. So that is why I suggest that the natural minor, the Aeolian mode, is really the central minor scale. If you had to learn one of these minor scales first, that's the one I'd go for. Notice how Aeolian mode has a flatted third and a flatted fifth. That's how we know it's minor. Also has a flat 6 and a flat 7, and it sounds like this. Flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. You have a page of Aeolian fingerings that you could look at too in order to play this scale on your guitar. If you're savvy enough, if you can put that red dot on a note that's a C note, you'll be playing in the same key as I am on the keyboard here, and you could play a C Aeolian scale right along with me. As a matter of fact, if you're really hip and you're really ahead of it, you could use any one of those 12 fingerings for the Aeolian mode, and as long as the red dot, which is note number 1, was on a C alphabet letter note somewhere on the neck of your guitar, you'd be playing that scale. That's the Aeolian mode. Now, the last minor scale of the 5 that we're looking at for this moment anyway is what's called harmonic minor. Now, notice how harmonic minor is pretty much identical to the natural minor until you get up to the 7th note, and here's where it's different. Natural minor goes a whole step up from flat 6 to flat 7, whereas the harmonic minor jumps 1.5 steps up to note number 7. This is our first scale that has a 1.5 step interval in it. We're actually skipping over 2 different notes here to get from flat 6 up to 7. That's a very significant difference in these two scales right here, the fact that one has a flat 7 and one has a 7 in it. A lot of you have probably wondered about that for a long time. When we talk about minor key music in about 3 hours from now, you'll see the important distinction between natural minor and harmonic minor. Let's listen to that scale. Of the minor scales that we've played so far, this is going to be one of the easiest ones to recognize by ear because of that 1.5 interval in it. That 1.5 interval sounds like something, doesn't it? And it's going to give this minor scale a very Middle Eastern, kind of Arab type musical sound to the upper part of the scale. Here it is. See if you don't agree. Doesn't that sound like Middle Eastern music? Actually, that isn't the scale that they use in the Middle East. There are scales that sound even more Middle Eastern than that. For example, this scale, which I won't even bother to tell you about, but listen to how Middle Eastern this sounds. But harmonic minor does, in the upper part of the scale, have that kind of Middle Eastern sound. Now, another thing you might be asking yourselves is, listen to all of these different minor scales. I'm supposed to know what these sound like? I'm supposed to be able to tell the difference between these scales? In many ways, they're all so similar, they're only different by one note. Will I ever get to the point where I can tell one from another? Let me play them all and listen to them. I'm just going to play them all one at a time in a sequence, and you'll go, oh my God, will I ever be able to tell the difference? Here's melodic minor. Here's Dorian. Here's Phrygian. Here's Aeolian. Here's harmonic minor. You're going to yourself, boy, they all sound so similar, I'll never be able to tell the difference. And the answer is, actually, you will. That's what ear training is all about. When we get to our ear training part of the program, you will get to the point where you can tell these different scales. The fact that they sound similar, though, also brings up another misconception to people a lot of times. They go, if they all sound so similar, where do I use one and where do I use another one? If they all sound so similar, are they interchangeable? Can I use, say, Dorian or Aeolian in the same place in a song or something? And the answer is kind of yes and no. Later on, you'll find out that you have a lot of leeway as to how to play with these scales, but for now, particularly, I would actually want to say no, that there are very specific chords in the chord progression that these very specific scales go over. And even though right now, when you're listening to these scales, you can't necessarily tell one from the other, if you were playing a song, and in that moment of the song, you were supposed to be playing Dorian mode, which has a 6 in it, and you decided to play Aeolian mode instead, which has a flat 6 in it. Even now, right now, when I'm playing these scales, you can't tell the difference between them. If you play Aeolian in a place where Dorian is supposed to be, that flat 6 will stand out like a sore thumb. That flat 6 will sound like an obviously wrong note. So what you're going to find out is, even though they sound very similar, you have to use them in very specific places, at least initially in your construction of melodies, when you're writing songs or when you're improvising. Okay, those are our 5 different minor scales that we're looking at. So far we've looked at 3 different major scales, happy sounding scales with 3s and 5s, and 5 different minor scales with flatted thirds. The next scales we're going to be going on to are very, very interesting scales. These are the scales that you might have been told are the most common and important scales in popular music. These are the pentatonic scales, and they are certainly very important, but when we actually talk about pentatonic scales in a couple of hours, I'm going to, in a sense, paint a picture that in many ways they aren't anywhere near as significant as a lot of people say they are. What is a pentatonic scale? Pentatonic means 5 note. Now, I encourage everyone, as I think I mentioned in the first show on scales, to actually think of these scales as having 6 notes in them, because you don't want to forget your octave notes up here. Remember, a lot of people think that a major scale only has 7 notes, because they would say that the 8th note is the same as the first. They're both Do. They would both be C, for example, if you were in the key of C. But I always say don't forget your octave note, because you want to remember that there's an interval there that gets you back up to the octave. In the case of the major scale, that's a half step. Likewise, in the pentatonic scale, people say that there's 5 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I say don't forget that octave note. Think of the pentatonic scale as having a 6th note in it, because you'll want to know about that last interval there that takes you from the 5th note back up to the octave again. Pentatonic scales mean that they have 5 or 6 notes on it, depending on how you look at it. Now, another thing to realize then is, if a scale has fewer notes per octave, those notes must be further apart in order to cover the same distance. Notice, for example, that pentatonic scales do not contain any half steps at all. The smallest interval in a pentatonic scale is a whole step. But then also notice that in pentatonic scales, both major pentatonic and minor pentatonic, there are 2 augmented second intervals. There are 2 step-and-a-half intervals. There are 2 places in the scale where you actually skip over 2 notes to get from one note to the next note in the scale. So, a major pentatonic scale goes like this: 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3. That's how we know it's a major pentatonic scale, because once again it has a 3 and a 5 in it. But here's where it gets interesting. 1, 2, 3, then we skip over the 4 and the sharp 4, step-and-a-half interval, jump up to 5, whole step to 6. Then we skip over 2 more notes to get up to the 8. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8 is a major pentatonic scale. Let's listen to that scale. First of all, let's listen to our good old friend, the major diatonic scale again. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, an interesting thing to note about the pentatonic scale is a pentatonic scale is pretty much exactly like a major diatonic scale. It just has 2 notes left out of it, the 4 and the 7. So a major pentatonic scale goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, like this. A couple of interesting things about the pentatonic scale. Eventually you've got to ear train this scale too. Some of you older folks might recognize that old song. I don't even know who wrote it. Remember this riff? Sunshine on a cloudy day. It was that Smokey Robinson or something like that. Anyway, the riff that's in that song is actually nothing more than a major pentatonic scale. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. Major pentatonic scale. Another thing you might notice about pentatonic scales is, did you notice almost a little bit of like an Oriental, like Chinese kind of sound to that scale? In fact, I can even enhance that a little. Sounds a little bit like Chinese music. The Chinese had pentatonic scales like 3000 BC or something like that. They were writing music based on pentatonic scales. A lot of classic Chinese music involves pentatonic scales. Next scale we're going to look at is our second pentatonic scale. It is a minor pentatonic scale. How do we know that it's a minor pentatonic scale? Well, it has a flatted third in it. Remember, sad sounding scales have flatted thirds. This is a minor scale. It's got a flat 3 and a 5 in it. Notice also it has 6 notes per octave with 2 step-and-a-half intervals in it and no half steps. That's how we know it's a pentatonic scale. Pentatonic scale goes 1 step-and-a-half up to flat 3, whole step to 4, whole step to 5, step-and-a-half up to flat 7, whole step to 8. Let's listen to what that sounds like. 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. You know, where you've heard this song a lot, I mean this scale a lot, a lot of you know how to play this scale, and you've been told that this is one of the most important scales in rock music, and that is true. The minor pentatonic scale is the basis of what is known as a blues scale, and is a scale that is used a lot in blues type of music. And when I mean blues, I don't even mean old blues like Muddy Waters or B.B. King or stuff. I don't even mean middle-aged blues like Eric Clapton or Stevie Ray Vaughan. I'm talking an awful lot of hard rock music in general, and heavy metal and alternative and funk music is actually based on the same, what I'm going to call blues kind of thinking, and is very heavily tied up in this type of scale right here, isn't it? Here's a little bit of something that kind of sounds like the blues, doesn't it? This could also be any number of Led Zeppelin riffs, even Rage Against the Machine and Limp Bizkit and Metallica, and a lot of these hard rock, very modern kind of hard rock bands are all employing a kind of thinking. Wouldn't you agree that the mood of most modern alternative and heavy metal music is pretty negative? It's pretty sad, you know what I mean? It doesn't have an awful lot of very happy moments in it at all. A lot of that stuff is coming from the notes that are in a minor pentatonic scale. Now, we'll be talking a lot more about these scales, too, in the coming weeks. We're going to spend most of an entire show on this blues type of thinking in music. And so we'll be talking about that more then. We're also, as you'll see over the next couple of weeks, we're going to give you what I call a jam tape. We're going to give you some chord progressions that you can jam along with on your at home on your guitar. They're going to be right on your videotape along with your video lesson. You're also going to have some music that you can jam along with. And we'll be giving you a blues progression that you can practice your minor pentatonic scales with. We have 3 more scales on our must-know list here. These scales are much less common than most of the other scales that are on our page right here, but they represent such specialized moments in music that even though they don't show up all that often, you still have to know something about them when they come. Whole tone and diminished scales, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, are examples of symmetrical scales. I want to suggest that all these other scales we've seen so far are asymmetrical. They're lopsided. There's a whole step here and a half step there. There doesn't appear to be any great pattern to the way the intervals fall. I mean, if you look close enough, you will see some patterns, but these symmetrical scales have very rigid patterns of intervals. For example, a whole tone scale is all whole steps. There's no half steps, there's no step and a half intervals. All the notes are separated by a whole step, and it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, sharp 5, sharp 6, 8. And you're going, boy, that's weird sounding, but at the same time, I bet you're also still going, But wow, that does sound familiar. I know I've heard stuff like this before. I'll show you kind of a funny kind of cliche place where you hear whole tone scales all the time. You don't hear it in pop music so much, but you might bump into it quite often in like movie soundtrack music or in the TV, in the music that's behind the TV show you're watching. Let's say we're watching a movie, right? Tell me what's going on in the movie right now. You ever heard something like this in a movie? Oh, let me go up an octave. What's going on in the movie that we're watching right now? Kind of like, doesn't it sound like they use that a lot of times when somebody's dreaming or when they're having a hallucination or something like that? That is a whole tone scale. Played over an equally symmetrical chord. Symmetrical scales, by the way, go with symmetrical chords, called an augmented chord. There is 2 whole steps in between each of the notes in this chord. And that's kind of the chord that's tailor-made to go along with a whole tone scale. And you've heard that in the movies plenty of times. So that's all we'll talk about right now for a whole tone scale. The other symmetrical scale is a scale that keeps flopping back and forth. Whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. You've also heard this one in the movies too. This is what's called a diminished scale. Here's what it sounds like. Oops. Let me do that again. That's a diminished scale. You know where you've heard this one in the movies? I always call this the woman tied to the railroad tracks chord. From the old silent movies, it sounds like Fear. This is a symmetrical chord called a diminished chord. And it's symmetrical in that each of the notes in the chord is 1.5 steps apart. It's a symmetrical chord. What's the scale that goes with that? A symmetrical scale that goes whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. Now, you don't hear that a lot in pop music, do you? Actually, you run into a diminished chord now and then in rock music and stuff like that, and so you will run into that every now and then. Only one more scale on our must-know list down here, the good old Locrian mode. This is another one of our Greek-named scales. It's not a symmetrical scale, but notice I have it at the bottom of the page because it's neither a major scale or a minor scale. It's a special, it's more related to this diminished thing. Notice that neither your whole tone or your diminished scale have 5s in them. A whole tone scale has a sharp 5 and a diminished scale has a flat 5. So these last 3 scales are neither major or minor. They fall into their own categories. Whole tone scales, as I mentioned before, are more related to the subject of augmented. And both diminished scales and Locrian mode are both tied up more in what's known as diminished because they have a flatted 5th in them. Locrian goes 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. Sounds like this, a very dismal sounding scale. 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7. Meant to go along with very tragic sounding chords too. It's beyond sad, absolutely irredeemably tragic, called a half diminished chord or a minor 7 flat 5. Listen to how tragic that chord sounds. Now listen to this, how nicely that scale, that Locrian mode, goes with that chord. So, you see what I mean? All of these scales are very common, and you've heard them a million times before. Now, that's all the time we've got for today. So, for right now, next week we're going to look at modes. We didn't get an awful lot of time to look at our finger charts today, but I hope I managed to get you to understand what this is all about. You have a finger chart for each one of these different scales on this list right here, and there's 12 different ways to play every one of these scales. Start on the red dot, because that's note number 1, and then just follow through on them. Start with the easy easy ones. Start with the ones that have no finger shifts in them, and start on a red dot and just start to get an idea yourself of how to finger these. And the whole time, listen to the scales as you play them, and you'll already be doing some ear training. Okay, this is Scotty West. Wait till you see our next show on modes and how they knit chords and scales together. But until then, have a great time and keep on practicing. Keep looking over your old notes you got to review, and we'll see you next week on Absolutely Understand Guitar. Okay? Thanks. Bye.